4 years ago, Russia launched its second invasion of Ukraine. The war that's followed has killed hundreds of thousands, displaced millions, and reshaped the security order of Europe.
Russia is running the strategy on both these dimensions, both the battlefront and the war against Ukrainian will to continue the war, and that on the second battlefront, they're putting Ukraine under great pressure.
Today, the front line barely moves. Russia grinds forward at enormous cost. Ukraine holds on through technological ingenuity and sheer will. But the strain is showing. Rolling blackouts, decimated energy infrastructure, and a population deep into war weariness.
Putin does not want the war to end. He wants to establish what I call effective political control of Ukraine, which includes a great deal more of Ukrainian territory and a subservient government in Kyiv.
Against that backdrop, a new diplomatic push is underway. The US, Russia, and Ukraine have been meeting in Abu Dhabi, in Geneva, through back channels. President Zelenskyy has called the talks constructive, but so far, Russia has not said yes to a single concrete proposal.
We're putting the United States on the line to deal with renewed Russian aggression, where Russia's in a strategically advantageous position. So it's not smart for us, and it's potentially suicidal for Ukraine.
And behind the negotiations, a tension is building. The U.S. is pressing Ukraine to surrender fortified territory in Donetsk that Russia's own army has been unable to take, while the security guarantees Washington is offering in return remain vague. And $300 billion in frozen Russian assets hang in the balance, potentially the key to Ukraine's post-war survival, or a bargaining chip in a deal no one has agreed to. So where does the war stand? What would it actually take to reach a settlement? And who pays the price if one falls apart?
The only way you can achieve Trump's stated goal of a durable peace is to put pressure on the aggressor.
We're seeing the emergence now of a maritime struggle of a kind we have not seen before in world history.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, peace in Ukraine. Deal or deadlock? Today, we're joined by Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, and Professor Philip Zelikow, Botha Chan Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Moderating the discussion is Dr. Joanna Gładczewski.
So I will start with you, Ambassador Herbst. If you could please provide a brief background to where the war in Ukraine stands, what are the main issues currently being negotiated in the process between U.S., Russia, and Ukraine, and was anything accomplished with the current talks in Geneva that just ended?
All the key elements as I remember them. First, on the battlefield, it is overwhelmingly a stalemate. And there's a common wisdom, which would be in quotation marks, that Russia is inevitably grinding forward. And that's simply not accurate. The Russians picked up very little territory over the last 6 weeks, and they paid an enormous price in casualties to the point where they are unable to replace, whether by encouraging people in the global south to come to Russia to get good jobs, which actually means to be fighting Ukrainians in Ukraine, or offering major economic incentives for Russians to volunteer. And they're not volunteering in sufficient numbers. The Ukrainians have regularly out casualtied the Russians, to make up a verb. British intelligence back late last spring talked about 5 or 6 to 1 casualty ratio favoring Ukraine. And there are legitimate reports that in some of the offensives around Kupiansk in northern Ukraine, the casualties have been more like 25 or more to 1. And over the past couple of weeks, the Ukrainians have made small gains on multiple spots on the front, recapturing something like 200 square kilometers. Not a large number, but the point is not Russian gains, but Ukrainian gains. As for the negotiations, Trump states that his goal is to achieve a secure and stable peace, which leaves Ukraine standing as a sovereign nation. his efforts to do so, while energetic, have not been particularly successful for one very simple reason. Putin does not want the war to end. He wants to establish what I call effective political control of Ukraine, which includes a great deal more of Ukrainian territory and a subservient government in Kyiv. There is no indication of any change in Putin's war goals. And while negotiations proceed, we've not yet to see any real Russian concessions. The only way you can achieve Trump's stated goal of a durable peace is to put pressure on the aggressor, the one who has said no, at this point, a half a dozen times to specific ceasefire or peace proposals that the Ukrainians accepted. And Trump has done some solid things in this area, most importantly in October, when he put sanctions on the two major Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, but to actually force Putin to make a fair peace, or not a fair peace, a stable peace, you're going to have consistent pressure over time. That means economic sanctions. That means sending more advanced U.S. arms, even if the Europeans pay for them, to Ukraine. And here's where Philip's done extraordinary work, finding some way to make sure that the remainder of the $300 billion of Russian frozen state assets wind up in Ukraine's hands, and not in Russia's hands, nor for that matter, America's hands. The U.S. is pushing Ukraine in an extraordinarily bad idea to give up fortified Western Donbass, which the Russian army has been unable to take despite 4 years since the big invasion began. And why is that such a bad idea? Because to the west of Western Donbass, you essentially have open steppe and open forest, highways which take you straight to Kyiv and to the Dnipro River. Now, to make this palatable to Ukraine, Trump has changed his position and is willing to offer Ukraine security guarantees. Now, we don't know what they are. We do know that Zelenskyy has said they were very good, just a little disagreement about the amount of time they would obtain. That may be true, but even if that's true, it would be foolish to Ukraine to give up territory, which leaves their country open to future Russian aggression. And again, Putin has not changed his war aims. And it's actually not the smartest policy in the world for the United States, because we're giving security guarantees and we're giving Russia territory in Ukraine, heavily fortified territory in Ukraine, which the Russians themselves cannot conquer. We're putting the United States on the line to deal with renewed Russian aggression, where Russia's in a strategically advantageous position. So it's not smart for us, and it's potentially suicidal for Ukraine.
And so in other words, kind of short-term thinking, but not looking at it in the long run. Yes.
Correct.
Thank you. And now switching gears to more of the economic aspect, Paco. Economic issues loom large in a potential peace agreement. I wonder if you can list some of them, and then also who is currently the largest provider of aid to Ukraine?
Well, the situation's actually in some ways pretty straightforward. The United States has cut off all economic and military aid to Ukraine except for the provision of intelligence support. But the United States no longer pays for any military supplies. Anything that Ukraine wants from the United States, Ukraine has to pay for in cash. So all American foreign assistance to Ukraine has essentially stopped, except for the continued provision of intelligence support. Everything else is bought. So the Ukraine can cover the majority of its expenses through its own resources, but can't afford the war or the continuation of the war without very large financial support from partners. Those are now entirely European. So for about the last year, virtually all financial support that's keeping Ukraine in the war comes from Europe and European friends. Ukraine has been doing actually an exceptional job of managing its economy and holding things together under extremely difficult circumstances, having lost about nearly a third of its GDP with the Russian invasion almost right at the outset, and having millions of displaced people and millions of refugees. So this extraordinary upheaval, it's nevertheless more or less holding things together, but it does that with a large international aid effort behind it, which is entirely from Europeans with some Japanese help, I should also acknowledge. Now, so that's the essential situation. Whether or not this level of European assistance is sustainable is a good question. And the long-term future of Ukraine's economy and any effort to rebuild Ukraine after the war does turn substantially on the utilization of the Russian assets that were seized and frozen, inside Western jurisdictions at the outset of the Russian invasion of 2022. Those amount to something like about $300 billion if you put the number into American currency, though the majority of the money is not held in dollars.
Great, thank you. And I know we'll touch on that a little later to go more into detail about that. And now switching back to you, Ambassador Herbst, we've mentioned the Russians have made small battle gains relative to the number of casualties and the limited territory occupied. How has Ukraine been able to hinder Russian advances, and what could shift the military balance either way decisively, if at all, at this point?
It really has been something of a stalemate, even with the gains Ukraine has made over the past couple of weeks. It's important to note that one reason for those gains, maybe the main reason for those gains, is the fact, one, that the Russians lost their use of Starlink, which they should not have had to begin with. But Starlink's been off the table, which I think gave Ukraine the initiative to make those gains, which continue, by the way, But the Russians also, we might say, used a 22 to shoot themselves in the foot on this issue. Of course, the removal of Starlink hindered command and control communications. But then the Russians also, for reasons of censorship and state control over the country, have put major restrictions on the use of telegram channels. And the Russian military were also using those channels to conduct some of their field communications at the front. So that's been a key new factor. But having said that, I believe we're looking at stalemate in the future. That's kind of a projection forward of what we're currently seeing. The Russian economy is under serious pressure. Russian military is now not able to replace its fallen soldiers because of reasons I've already mentioned. And conceivably, at some point in the future, that can lead to a collapse on the Russian side. You can't rule out a collapse on the Ukrainian side, but I'm more skeptical of that because the Ukrainians have shown remarkable ingenuity managing their vulnerabilities. The principal vulnerability that people have been discussing, which in fact the Ukrainian authorities could partly remedy, was the underutilization of their manpower. So they didn't have enough soldiers. That's partly because they're still reluctant to draft what Americans consider to be the ideal cohort, meaning 18 to 22-year-olds. But they've made up for that largely with their ingenious use of technology. And that's why, despite a sparsely populated front, Russian forces could not make great gains because of the use of various drones, mainly in the air, but also on the ground. And that's what's led to these tremendous Russian casualties. So I expect the stalemate to continue, maybe slightly favoring Ukraine, but without any major new developments.
If I may, Joanna, my take on this, I think John's points are very good. I supplement them a little bit. The Russians are running a military strategy in two dimensions. One dimension is, of course, the strategy to advance on the battlefront that John has described. The other dimension, however, increasingly is a strategic military campaign that targets Ukraine's energy infrastructure and its will to continue the war. So they're running, just as in World War II, there was a campaign that was being conducted on the battle lines, and a strategic bombing campaign against the enemy homeland. The Russians are conducting a strategic missile campaign against the Ukrainian homeland that is causing quite serious damage. I noticed that one of the questioners is coming in from Odessa. Someone in Odessa knows very well how much damage is being done and the hardships people in Odessa are going through this winter. So the Russians have succeeded in targeting and collapsing a large part of Ukraine's energy infrastructure and are creating a set of rolling blackouts and energy shortages in which people are enduring a very difficult winter under extreme circumstances. So the Russian campaign is succeeding in putting enormous strain and pressure on the Ukrainian people. To credit them, so far, the Ukrainian people are displaying astonishing resilience in the face of all this hardship. But it's important to acknowledge the degree of hardship and war weariness that is widespread in Ukraine, that Russia is playing on in the hopes that as the war continues with redoubled offensives in the spring and summer of this year, that morale in Ukraine may eventually implode and Ukraine will suffer an internal collapse of some kind, which is often the way wars of attrition end. So then we can have an evaluation of whether that Russian strategy will work or not. But it's important to notice that Russia is running the strategy on both these dimensions, both the battlefront and the war against Ukrainian will to continue the war, and that on the second battlefront, they're putting Ukraine under great pressure.
Thank you so much for pointing that out, because that indeed, it very much is the case. So I appreciate that. So I'll stay with you then, Professor Zelikow, because we're going to now dive into this $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. So how could this impact the war if these funds were turned over to Ukraine, in addition to if there were additional U.S. sanctions? And in addition, one more thing, too, is what is the role of Russia's shadow fleet?
Yeah, so those are two excellent questions. So what's happened now over about 4 years of work to first lock down and then harness the Russian assets to support Ukraine is, after a great deal of diplomatic struggle, is that the assets have been pretty effectively locked down, so that now the position that's been enacted into European law, actually, is that the assets cannot be returned to Russia unless there is a peace deal that compensates Ukraine for the damages. And the presumption is that the Russian assets will then have to be used as part of such a deal to help reconstruct Ukraine. So that's an achievement. There has some of the European aid to help Ukraine, an important portion of it, leverages the Russian assets as basically the collateral for loans that are being made to Ukraine, that therefore Ukraine does not have to repay, and therefore does not count against Ukraine's credit burdens when its credit worthiness is assessed by outside entities like the International Monetary Fund. So, but when you assess the medium-term future of Ukraine, the Russian assets, these hundreds of billions of dollars, are just a crucial variable in whether or not Ukraine has a post-war future. Now, it's really important, since mainly we tend to emphasize right now how we keep Ukraine in the war. It is useful to see this looking forward as two different futures, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole. That is, there's one future in which Ukraine is defeated. Its economy goes into a downward spiral. It becomes a huge economic drag, not only on Ukraine, but on all of Europe, with millions of additional refugees and an enormous source of stress for Europe as a whole. Or there is a stable resolution and Ukraine is on the path to rebuilding, in some association with the European Union, and Ukraine, by the way, which has enormous potential for development, basically starts mirroring the path, say, that Poland has mirrored in developing over the next 10, 20 years, and actually becomes an engine for European growth and European investment, fueled in part by this hundreds of billions of dollars that are being held in reserve for just this purpose by having locked up the Russian assets. In that prospect, not only does Ukraine's future actually look relatively bright, but Europe's future as a whole also looks considerably brighter. Europe really is standing at the crossroads between these two pathways, not only for Ukraine's future, but for Europe's economic future. It's that realization, I think, that's fueled the additional German and European resolve to somehow be sure these assets are harnessed in any post-war future. My view is that since Russia is not going to agree to a post-war future that's as bright as what I've described, you have to start proceeding to enact that future without waiting upon Russia to agree to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But then that leads me to the question, what is Russia doing to try to prevent the release of these assets?
Oh, well, what it does is it tries to blackmail every country involved to the extent it has leverage over them. The methods of blackmail vary and are mostly out of public view. So, and in this effort, Russia also urges its friends like China, also at times the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to weigh in, let's say, for example, with French officials and say, don't participate in doing anything in these Russian assets, or we won't buy French bonds anymore, which then creates financial problems for the French finance ministry, which is under enormous pressure domestically. There are even some of the blackmail may even have extended to covert threats against the personal safety of people, of certain officials in Belgium and officials at the European clearinghouse, Euroclear, in which a large fraction of the Russian assets are currently frozen. So the blackmail methods are of a number of kinds. For a while, the Russians were receiving a kind of tacit assistance from well-meaning international lawyers who would argue that you can't do anything to Russia without Russia's consent, and therefore, we can't, who made the false argument that taking Russia's assets would somehow violate international law, even though Russia, as an international outlaw, has opened itself up to countermeasures, lawful countermeasures under international law. But I think mostly those international legal arguments that were actually helping Russia have substantially fallen away. And what's left now is mainly various forms of blackmail and threats to disrupt the finances of particular countries, retaliate against Western economic interests that remain in Russia, retaliate, for example, against Japanese gas interests in Siberia if Japan goes along, and so on. And most of that diplomacy, shall we call it, occurs outside of public view and outside of press notice.
Great. Thank you so much for explaining that. And now I'll turn to you, Ambassador Herbst, and this will be the last question before I turn to the Q&A. The biggest question remains whether Putin will agree to whatever terms are reached. And we've seen how Russia, even during this whole negotiation process, continues to bomb Ukraine endlessly. So do you think it is, at this point in time especially, is it in Putin's interest to reach a peace agreement? And if he's not willing to do, what's going to happen next, how long can this go on, do you think?
His goal remains to have effective political control of Ukraine and probably, although not certainly, a great deal more of Ukrainian territory. Lavrov, the foreign minister, who is not a policymaker, but he tries to reflect Putin's views, keeps talking about Russia having control of quote-unquote Novorossiya, which extends in the northeast from Luhansk, which the Russians already have, but all the way down to the southwest, the entire Ukrainian Black Sea coast, including Odessa, to the country of Moldova. So Putin has no interest in any of Trump's peace proposals. But Putin has a great interest in trying to reduce American support for Ukraine. And clearly, Trump came in with his own views regarding American aid. And as Philip mentioned, we stopped providing both military and economic aid out of our pockets right after Trump took the Oval Office, except for anything was in the pipeline from the Biden administration. But Putin always thought he could persuade Trump to move in Putin's direction. And he's had some success, but by no means complete success. And Trump has kind of vacillated between putting pressure on Russia, because it is obviously the obstacle to peace. And Trump had said when he took office for the second term that he would make the obstacle to peace pay. And we saw that when Trump put the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. But then, because he's just kind of reluctant to pressure Putin, he then turns around and blames Zelenskyy when Zelenskyy has said yes to virtually every proposal that Trump has put in play and Putin has rejected. But it's worth diving a little bit into this, because this helps us understand what's going on right now with the negotiations. Trump set a pretty hard line for Russia to stop shooting at Ukrainians of August 8. And 2 or 3 days before that deadline, Witkoff showed up in Moscow, said that Putin showed a new flexibility. Trump let that deadline slide. And instead of new American sanctions on Russia, you had the Anchorage meeting, the summit. And nothing was achieved at that summit. And you had Zelenskyy and 6 or 7 other European leaders descend on the White House 3 days after the Anchorage summit. And then Trump began to move in the direction of putting pressure on Russia. That pressure included, for the first time, Trump talking about sending Tomahawk missiles, American missiles, to Ukraine, which can travel up to 2,000, even a little bit more, kilometers. Zelenskyy and Trump had a meeting where this came up in New York in September. And then Zelenskyy was coming back to the White House in mid to late October. Putin called Trump 3 days before that, dissuaded him from offering Tomahawks. And Trump said that publicly. He didn't say he was dissuaded by Putin, but the context suggests that's what happened. And Trump announced that he and Putin may be meeting in Budapest for a summit. But even though Trump said that, he then had second thoughts. And he said, well, no, we talked about that in principle, but I want Rubio to talk to Lavrov to see if there's going to be real progress at that summit. Rubio talked to Lavrov and said, nothing's going to happen. And then Trump said, no summit. And that's when Trump sanctioned. Rosneft and Lukoil. Putin was stunned by that and concerned. And so what did he do? His own personal charm with Trump had not quite worked. So he used his second card. He dispatched Kirill Dmitriev, a very Western presentable Russian operative, also married into Putin's family distantly, to see Witkoff in Florida. And they spent weeks talking. And then the United States brought to Ukraine the 28-point American peace plan, American being in quotation marks because Russian fingerprints were all over that. And that the Ukrainians basically said no. And for some reason, either Dmitriev or someone on the American side leaked the details, which was an embarrassment to the administration. That included, by the way, the most bizarre point of all, not the most damaging, but the most bizarre point of all, that of the frozen Russian assets, 200 billion would go to the U.S. and Russia. And that, I believe, may still be the U.S. position, although they publicly backed away from it. And right now you have the negotiations where they are. So basically, the negotiations you have some progress between the U.S. and Ukraine, but there's not one indication, not one yes from Russia to any concession at this point in time. And I don't think there's going to be such concessions because the Russians still think they can manipulate the administration. They haven't been quite successful at it, but they've had some measure of progress from their point of view.
Right. Thank you so much. And actually, if I can follow on, can you explain a little bit about what the shadow fleet, the importance of the shadow fleet is for Russia?
Well, when we began to go after Russian energy with sanctions, and the collective West, did a pretty good job, not terrific, but a pretty good job in those efforts. We helped diminish hydrocarbon revenues for Russia, which are extremely important to the Russian economy. And in fact, it's worth noting that one of the reasons why the Soviet Union imploded at the end of the 80s is because there was a great drop in oil prices starting from the oil highs in 1982 by the time you got to the end of that decade. And that put severe pressure on the Soviet economy. But one way Russia compensated was by selling its oil at discount rates to China and India, and by moving its oil not on registered, insured tankers, but on, you might say, the dregs of commercial shipping, unsafe vessels carrying that oil around the world. And there were some efforts starting about 2 years ago to go after the shadow fleet, and they achieved, I'd say, only marginal success. But since Venezuela, the Venezuelan operation, I think 8 or 9 Russian vessels have been seized, not just by us, and Trump didn't give a damn about Putin's concerns there. And actually, I'll come back to that in a second. But even the Europeans got into the act. And so this is beginning to take a real toll, which is what prompted Patrushev's remarks. So this is an important new factor. Oh, by the way, yes, the reason why Putin does not complain to the U.S. about this is because all of his energy on the U.S. is focused on preventing the U.S. from taking actions that benefit Ukraine in the form of sanctions and weapons, but also hoping to decouple American support for Ukraine, including ultimately the military intelligence, which remains critical.
The question about the shadow fleet is actually quite interesting, as I just want people to notice a lot of different things that are happening in different ways. What's happening is a gigantic maritime struggle has materialized in which now there is an entire parallel universe involving thousands of ships operating outside of the normal international maritime system. And we are now slowly beginning to wage a form of maritime warfare against Russia, Iran, Venezuela, with Chinese vessels and Chinese mercantile interests involved in all of it. That's occurring simultaneously on all these fronts in which, for instance, the government of India just immobilized a couple of ships that were being used to transship oil for Iran. So the Venezuela, Iran, Russia business with now some European participation, we're seeing the emergence now of a maritime struggle of a kind we have not seen before in world history over the control of the world seas. And just one thing that's worth noting about this struggle, it's founded entirely on reliance on international law, which is, by the way, something that in daylight, the Trump administration ostentatiously derides. Yet this entire international maritime struggle is founded on common adherence to principles of international law that we're now trying to enforce in this fascinating gray zone warfare.
Actually, if I could just jump in here on this too. One reason I think that the administration is only too happy to go along with this is because Trump has stated as one of his goals to become the dominant hydrocarbon superpower. And this actually facilitates that aim. And obviously makes it much harder for Putin to continue his war in Ukraine.
Well, this is another topic, yet another topic for a good panel. This thousands, that's amazing to me, that number. Well, we've run out of time, but I would like to thank both Ambassador Herbst and Professor Zelikow for a fascinating and very insightful discussion about how complicated peace to reach a peace agreement is in Ukraine.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.